Moving to this case, Doctor, were you employed as a chief medical examiner in the Ninth Judicial Circuit back on August 2nd of 2014?
Yes, I was.
And did you, on that date, perform the autopsy of a deceased eventually identified as 16-year-old Alexandria Chery under medical examiner case number 2014-001022?
Yes.
Did you eventually prepare a report to document your findings and conclusions?
Yes.
And when was that report completed?
So back then, let's see, I don't think the date of completion, oh, well, yeah, it is. It was completed on October 28th, 2014.
And the report that I have is 12 pages in length, and then there are 4 pages of diagrams. Is that what you have?
That's correct.
All right, and I say what you have because I see sitting in front of you, it appears to be your case file and report. Is that right?
Right, this is the case file from the medical examiner's office.
So if you're going to review your report, just let us know. That way, if there's an objection, we can go forward, okay?
Okay.
Now, you performed the autopsy at 10 a.m. on August 2nd of 2014. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's when it started.
Can you start by telling us the height of the remains as found?
She was measured, I can look at this, is
Yes,
that what
ma'am.
you're
Yes,
asking
ma'am.
me? So let me get this. She was measured to be 60 inches in length.
And that's 5 feet?
Yes.
Took me a second, too. Did you weigh the body of Alexandria Chery?
Yes.
Was it particularly relevant in this case? Her weight?
Well, she was decomposed, and so certainly as you become decomposed and start to skeletonize, your weight goes down. You're losing a lot of fluids, you're losing muscle mass. So she weighs, at the time, 51 pounds.
Can you describe the general condition of the decedent's body at the time you viewed it?
Yes, so she was decomposed. Her head was skeletonized with only a patch of firm, kind of almost leatherized tissue attached to the left side as part of the forehead, a little bit part of the scalp, and it had a few fine black hairs still attached, but the rest of the skull was skeletonized. No eyes left, no ears, external ears. The mandible is already disarticulated, right, because there's nothing holding the mandible, so that's disarticulated and found several feet away. The neck, the anterior part of the neck, the front of the neck, is completely skeletonized. There's no soft tissue left. There's no muscles left. There's no trachea left. There's nothing left there except the bone. Now, posteriorly, on the back of the neck, there were muscles, and that was still holding the skull in place. So that's, the skull is still there, and there's posterior neck muscles. And then the top part of her chest is also decomposed and partially skeletonized. I can see on the right, the first through part of the fourth rib is exposed, so that means her pleural cavity where her lung sits exposed. On the left, it's not so much. It goes above the breast, and I can only see kind of the clavicle exposed. So both clavicles were exposed, and then on the right, we've got the first, second, third, and part of the fourth rib, and on the left, mostly just the clavicle, and then the breast was still intact. So and then the upper arms, the left arm was completely, muscle has been taken away, partially skeletonized. Clearly, there had to be some animal scavenging on that because of the way the muscle has kind of been shredded off. And then part of the right arm is also, the muscle is off on the top part of the arm, but below the elbow, the skin is, the soft tissue is intact. Of course, the skin is kind of sloughed off, but it's still intact. Fingers are completely there from the right. Fingernails are no longer present. On the left hand, some animals, so there's been some, again, scavenging, and some of the bones are missing. And then you have kind of a leathery appearance, intact skin, basically above the left breast, basically the nipple on the right, and then the abdomen is completely intact, leathery, kind of firm, and that goes to below the umbilicus. And then, again, there's a lot of decomposition in the upper thighs and pelvic region. The vagina is no longer present. It's a big, the medial or inner aspect of the thighs are the skin's gone, muscles exposed, a lot of larvae, maggots. They're feeding on the tissues. The left femur, top of the femur is exposed, the leg bone. And then you've got intact skin again, just below that. So the lower legs, lower aspect of the legs, mid-thighs down, the legs look pretty much intact. Of course, the superficial skin is sloughed off. It's got a leathery appearance. The feet still have dark and pigmented skin. You could tell it was a Negroid race. The toenail, the skin is starting to deglove on the feet. The toenails can still be seen. They're painted a little bit of purple. On the back, it's a little bit different. Most of everything's there. You don't see the skeletonization, but a lot of maggot holes, softening of the tissues. Anal opening is completely gone. Kind of the inner aspect from decomposition, possibly even some animal, but that's completely gone. But softened, but intact. You don't see any skeletonization on the back because she was found on her back, so that was not exposed.
Consistent with your practice and description a few minutes ago, did you or your assistant take photographs of the body as you examined it?
Yes.
And did they include photographs, what are commonly referred to as dirty photographs, before the body had been cleaned?
Yes.
And then you also took photographs after that?
Correct.
Okay. Now, was the clothing that Alexandria Chery was wearing photographed as well?
Yes. And I'm sorry, I didn't mention the clothing on her.
Go ahead, if you wouldn't mind.
So there wasn't much clothing on her. She had a kind of a T-shirt that was kind of, just a regular T-shirt neck, short sleeve. It had the symbol of an A with circle around it, that pattern on it. And it was in a peculiar spot. It was no longer on the front of her. So it's as if you took your shirt and took your head out of the head hole and then put it over the back of your neck. So your sleeves or your arms are still in the shirt, but it's over onto the back. So there's nothing on the front. Her arms are still in it, but it's on her back, and it's also pulled up on the back. And then she also had a pair of real stretch panties. They're not like bikini, they're regular panties. I would call them like old women panties, they're regular size panties, and they're rolled down. So the waistband's kind of rolled down. And there's, of course, two defects. There's a defect on the back of the shirt, on the upper left side, and then there's a defect that goes horizontal, straight across the crotch of the panties, and just horizontal across, and then it's torn along the waistband portion of the left leg. It's clearly torn and shredded in that area, kind of torn from the band, with the crotch having it just straight across.
Okay. And you said you documented the clothing with photographs?
Yes, and the last piece of clothing valuable on her is a navel ring. She had a pierced navel with 2 pink stones. I'm sorry, I didn't bring that up.
It's okay. Did you collect the navel ring and package it as well?
Yes.
And did you also collect and package the shirt and the underwear, or the panties?
Yes.
And now to the photographs. We'll start with State's Exhibits BN. It's a composite of, I believe, 4 photographs. Sorry, it's 5 photographs. Previously described the clothing that was found and said that you collected the underwear, shirt, and the navel ring. Is that correct?
Correct.
Dr. Garavaglia, at some point you also consulted on this case with Dr. John Schultz, is that right?
That is correct.
And he, in the course of his consultation, took photographs of the skull of Alexandria Chery. Is that also accurate?
Correct, we both took photographs of the skull.
Yes, ma'am. You took them and then he took separate ones, is that right?
Correct.
Dr. Garavaglia, there is a portion of your report that is titled Evidence of Injury. Is that accurate?
Yes,
And that's the area where you document specific injuries located on the decedent's body?
correct.
So I'd like to start with the area or the section that is titled Sharp Force Injuries.
Okay.
What is the first sharp force injury you documented in your report?
This is a 3/4 inch sharp edge, a linear stab type defect which extends through the left breast at the nipple. It's on the lateral edge, or the nipple itself is at the lateral edge of the defect. It's 3/4 inches and it extends, it can be followed into the breast tissue for 1 to 1.5 inches. And in the breast tissue, it also has a very sharp linear appearance.
Now, may I approach the witness? What's in evidence of State's Exhibit 59?
You may.
Well, you can kind of see it on this one. It's a little bit folded. The breast tissue is folded partially over it. On the whole, when you're looking at so it's not a good picture of, but you can see it quite clearly in the breast tissue.
Okay, well, we'll put it on the screen then. So, Dr. Garavaglia, we're going to start with BN1.
Yeah, it's a little bit better, but, so, this is that kind of mummified skin, and it goes up to here, and here is the breast tissue here, but you can see on this picture, there's a fold in it. So the defect is here, but there's a better picture, I know there are better pictures.
You said BN5.
This one's a good picture, because what this is I've lifted up that tissue to see where it went. So this is that whitish tissue is breast tissue. And you can see it here. It's quite marked through the breast tissue. It's very clear. The skin is, it's got a defect, a linear defect, 3/4 inch, but the breast tissue, when that's not natural to have a defect through your breast tissue like that.
Was there any bone or skeleton involved with that defect?
No. So underneath the pleural cavity, which, the breast sits there, and then underneath of that is your muscles, and then underneath that's your ribs, basically, and then your pleural cavity, which is where your lungs sit. That anterior aspect of that pleural cavity, the front of that pleural cavity is still intact. I can see that. And I couldn't follow it. It did not go completely even through the breast. So it went about an inch into the breast tissue. It wasn't real deep. Inch to inch and a half.
Did you examine the victim's shirt for a defect that would be associated with that specific sharp force injury?
I did.
And did you find any defects or corresponding defects in the shirt indicating a stab wound or sharp force injury through the front of the shirt?
No, there was none to the front of the shirt.
Did the sharp force injury to the breast with the lack of corresponding defect to the shirt tell you anything during your examination?
It told me that it didn't go through the shirt, and the shirt was obviously pulled up. That's how we found it. I don't know if that's what position it was in when she got that, but the shirt was pulled up and didn't go through the shirt.
Were you able to determine, based upon your training and experience, what type of weapon or instrument was used to create the linear stab defect you just described? Or can you give us some examples?
Yeah, it would be consistent with a knife. I can't say that another sharp instrument, but it'd have to be about 3/4 of an inch or so. I mean, there is decomposition. It could be a half. It could be 3/4. The skin, changes. Relatively thin. Consistent with a knife could be like a sharp shard of glass that would give a thin defect like that, but it'd have to be 1.5 inches deep that went in. So in my experience, we usually see knife wounds that look like this.
Now, you previously mentioned in your testimony this morning scavenging
Yes?
different areas of the body. Could the wound you just described have been caused by a bird or other scavenger post-mortem after death, in your experience?
No, for a couple of reasons. One, the skin is intact, right? I think scavenging did occur, but it's isolated. As you can see, there's nothing else around it. There are no other marks around it. It's just one defect through the nipple area. And then scavenging also wouldn't make that clear 1.5-inch defect that you can see slit like into the breast tissue. No animal does that. Birds tend to go for open wounds and pull. That's why you can see the shreds of tissue left on the arms with no marks on the arms. There's no gnawing or kind of marks that we could see on the arms. So the fact that there's an isolated defect, the skin itself would be a little difficult, but that we have that nice defect through the breast tissue, clearly it is not scavenging. No animal would do that linear defect through the breast tissue.
Move on to the second sharp force injury you described, which I believe is to the, I'll let you pronounce it, is it thenar eminence?
The thenar eminence is this kind of fleshy part of the thumb.
You know,
So we have, it's the right hand. So we're looking at that right hand. We're looking at the palm. Here's the thumb. We have this sharp force injury here. And then we have this flap of skin made with sharp force injury also there, which is that webbing right here. So the thenar eminence, and then the webbing closer to between the thumb and the second finger. It's kind of that fleshy part.
now, I believe you described it as an incised wound. Can you tell the members of the jury what that is?
Yeah, so an incised wound versus a stab wound is deeper than it is wide. So an incised wound is more superficial but cut. So it doesn't go very deep. In fact, this just goes through those superficial skin layers, the dermis, and then it very superficially cuts the muscle underneath. But it doesn't go very deep. So it's more of a slice, an incised wound with the blade instead of a stab wound. And then this is a flap of skin. And so you can kind of lift that up. And that's what that is.
Does the incised nature of the wound and the location on the hand and the area of the hand tell you anything about the nature of the wound itself or how it was inflicted?
Yeah, that's a pretty classic defense wound on the hand. Also, that little flap of skin is very telling. It means that, and if you look at your hand, when you kind of bring your thumb over, you get that little kind of fold in the skin. And as the knife goes over it, so the thenar eminence is flat, it just goes across it, but it goes across that little fold that's sticking out, it causes a flap. And that's pretty classic what we see with a knife or a very sharp instrument going across the hand or hitting the hand. So we see that if there's other wounds on the body, like she has a defect through the breast, and that would be a pretty classic pattern for a defense wound, that little flap and then the cut on the thenar eminence.
Again, any reason to believe that that sharp force injury was a result of animal activity?
No, it doesn't. As you can see, there's no other animal activity on that hand. There's some maybe over here, but you can see there's nothing else going on here. And it doesn't pull. The muscles aren't pulled out from underneath. They're just they're just superficially cut underneath. And then, lo and behold, we have what we typically see when the hand is folded and a sharp goes under it, just a little flap. The animal wouldn't cause a little flap either.
Can you tell the members of the jury what the meaning of the terms antemortem, perimortem, and postmortem are?
Yeah, so it's different with, different specialties. So basically, antemortem is before death. Perimortem is around the time of death, usually at the time of the incident, what's going on. And of course, postmortem after death. So,
Is there evidence that this injury was perimortem?
yeah,
Or what tells you that it was?
well, first of all, she's got, clearly when you fold your hand like that to get that little flap, and the fact that she's got a cut on her hand is more indicative that she's trying to defend herself, so it would be about the time of the incident, perimortem. There's this question, there's also this discoloration of the skin. I wasn't quite knew what to make of that. I don't know if that's bleeding or not, but could it have occurred? It couldn't have occurred much before death because she'd have been bleeding from that. I mean, it didn't occur yesterday, the day before, because nobody mentioned that she had a cut on her hand that was fresh. So antemortem before death, not much before death, because I believe somebody saw her that morning. Nobody complained of a cut on the hand. Perimortem would be consistent that she's alive, and because her thumb is kind of opposed, right, causing that flap. Postmortem, it certainly didn't occur in that position. It'd be very hard to get that flap. Could I say that that happened right after death? No, I mean, I couldn't say. But it's sometime around the time of death. But you'd have to work to get that pattern with her hand not opposed. I'm not saying it's impossible that you couldn't move her finger and get that, but I guess my point is it's the pattern that tells me that it's about the time of death, and that the looks of it are relatively fresh.
Finally, did you identify a sharp force injury on the child victim's back or rear shoulder?
Yes, this one's a little more difficult on the skin. There's a defect to the skin on the back. It goes a little bit into the musculature. It's hard to follow because the musculature is relatively soft, but there's clearly a defect there. There's also a lot of defects. The skin's kind of breaking apart. The pores are opening up. There's some maggot activity back there, but there's no other scavenge. She's on her back. There's no scavenging back there, just the maggots, the insects.
I'm going to publish this exhibit EN3 of 59.
Right. So this one's a little more.
And then there's a close-up. That's the one if you want to look at the close-up.
Right. So you can see that this is her back. We've got her turned. Her neck is kind of turned. The muscles are still there. This is more mummified. This is what was on the ground. These are somewhat pores just kind of opening up, some maggot holes. There are some maggots here. One's coming out of a hole. So there's some defects here. And I really this is kind of irregular, but there's a little bit more regular one here. There's about a ½ an inch that actually went down. Most of the maggot holes don't go at anything. It's up here, actually. Okay, so it's actually up here is difficult. One second. But it's up here. And so, that one would bother me. I would just say, I called it a defect. Can't say that it's sharp force. But until I looked at the shirt, and there's a defect to the shirt, which is a little more telling. The fact that this wasn't exposed to anything, she was on her back. There's no other animal activity. Could have been a puncture, maybe with something. But her shirt was pulled up. The shirt was not in alignment with that wound at the time we found her, because the shirt's kind of pulled up. But when you look at the shirt, there's a defect that corresponds, just in about the same area as that defect to the shirt. Oh, it's still difficult, but. So this is the back of the T-shirt in the posterior left shoulder region, which is where this defect was located.
Again, did you come to any conclusions about antemortem, perimortem, or postmortem as to the defect in the rear of the child victim?
Again, I wouldn't be able to say that on the skin, but if she had a defect antemortem, that would be noticeable. And her shirt was on at the time she got the defect. Animal scavengers don't go through the shirt like that, and the back wasn't exposed. So I can't say for sure it wasn't postmortem, but it's consistent with something going through her shirt and then going into her back.
Now, you described how the sharp force injury to the thenar eminence would bleed. Would you expect bleeding from the other two sharp force injuries?
Yes.
Now I'd like to move to the evidence of injury titled blunt trauma to the head.
Okay.
Can you tell us what you mean by blunt trauma?
Not sharp force, not penetrating. It's like a blow to the head, whether the head hit something or something hit the head, which is blunt.
So I'm publishing on the screen, that's ER3 of State's Exhibit 16. I'll back that a little bit more. No, I won't, that's as far as it goes. So we'll start at the bottom with A, B, bottom left. If you could talk about the blunt trauma that you found and use the diagram to describe it. Well, let me put it this way. Can you start with the A fracture and describe it and then show us where it is?
Sure. So this is my diagrams of the best I can draw to try to depict these fractures. So what I call is fracture A is in total I measure it as about 2 3/4 inches. It starts on this, well, I don't know where it starts, but it goes across the right frontal bone and then this coronal suture. So it goes from one bone to the next. Goes from the frontal bone across the coronal suture and then on to the right parietal bone. So the total is about 2 3/4 inches fracture.
Dr. Garavaglia, is there any significance to fracture A crossing the coronal suture?
I think it needs usually more force.
Okay.
And then what we call is fracture B is this kind of curvilinear. This is kind of a complex fracture in here, and you can't really draw it all. But so we have this fracture that goes across, and it goes kind of this right lateral. You see it's on the frontal a little bit, and it goes kind of on this parietal a little bit. Then it goes on to the squamous portion of the temporal bone. So these are all on the side. And then it's a little irregular here, so there's about an inch, there's about a half an inch, there's another fracture just behind it. And then this also separates out the two bony plates. That's called a diastatic fracture, where the bony plates separate. So this separated, the squamosa suture. And then there's also a fracture on the inside that you don't see, whether it's portion of this or it's continuation of this.
Are you talking about fracture C?
Inside. What?
Are you talking about fracture C?
Yeah, C is really part of fracture B. And we could just see it. This is what we're looking at. This probably needs some clarification. What we're looking at is if I had cut off the top portion of your cranium, and we're looking at the base of the skull, and I remove the cranium, this would be the hole where your spinal cord goes down. This would be the top, the front of your head, and this would be the back of your head, as if we're looking down. You're on my table, I've cut the top part of your head off, and we're looking at the base of your skull. So this is fracture C, you can see that. And that's part of that B complex. It's kind of a bit of a complex fracture that it goes over those two sutures lines. It separates that squamous suture, and then you can also extend kind of on the inner aspect of that parietal bone at the squamous suture. So that's kind of a continuation of B.
So D is next, is that right?
Yes. So D is further down. It has nothing to do with either the parietal or frontal. It's completely only on this, what we call the squamous portion of the temporal bone, basically the temporal bone. And this fracture goes completely across from one side to the other. It's not curvilinear like these. It's straight across. It's I measured it at about 2 3/8 inches. And then we also have ZDE. Then we have E. This is a fracture, this bony part, kind of that, what we call the zygomatic arch. So your zygoma is here, kind of your cheekbone. You follow it out, and you have kind of an arch there. So that's broken. Fractured there, and then this is the actual zygomatic bone that makes part of the arch. That suture, it's a diastatic fracture, also separated. It's actually kind of pushed in. That whole arch is pushed in. And then we have, that's E. Then F is a small fracture. It's only 1/8 inch. It's on the tip of the nose. Now, keep in mind, your cartilage of the nose is no longer there. That's gone. But the very tip of the nose, there's a small 1/8 inch fracture right at the tip, and the hinges of the little bone is still there. And then there's a real thin fracture that goes down about 3/16 of an inch. It goes down on the side. And then we also have this chipped tooth. So this is like her molar wisdom tooth, and you go, this is the second, this is the third. So this would be basically your first molar on your upper right, and it's chipped down to the dentin on the lateral aspect.
What is that? Why is that significant, Dr. B?
Because your dentin is what you can feel, like that's that sensitivity. So your enamel keeps your teeth from hurting, right? From being sensitive. And then if that enamel comes off and you see the dentin, there's clearly, they would feel that. You'd feel that discomfort. I mean, it connects to the, by channels, it connects to the pulp and the nerve. It's yellow. It doesn't look like enamel.
You know the bottom diagrams?
Well, there's another chipped tooth here. And that's on the lower aspect. That's a right lateral incisor on the right, not your front one over. And that's also chipped down to the dentin. She was at the dentist actually about 10 days before she died, and none of those were recorded.
Okay, so I think you're up to fracture, well, you described A through E, which I believe were all on the right side of the skull.
Correct. No, now we got to go to the front.
Yes, ma'am.
So now we have E, now we have
You talked about F already. I think we're
F
at
is
G.
the nose, then we have G. So G is difficult because there's so much shading here. G is a fracture that is in the orbital plate. It's kind of goes along the orbital plate. You know where your eyeball sits? That's in your orbit, right? The bony orbit. And it goes across the edge of that bony orbit onto the zygomatic bone and the maxillary bone. So it kind of crosses two bones down the front. But it's clearly in the orbit rim and then down on the right, the lower orbital rim. And that's G. Then H is another orbital rim fracture in the frontal bone. These actually are harder to break up here. And
Why are they harder to break?
they take more force.
Because of the nature of the bone or the
Yes.
location?
Both. The frontal bone is harder to break, along the rim at least. And then, so this one goes across the bone, and then it's actually fractures the orbit of the frontal bone inside the orbit. And extends, onto the roof of the orbit fracture, so inside where the eye sits. And then we also have J, which doesn't even connect to the outside. It's just on the orbit itself, on the roof of the orbit, where the eye, it wouldn't be exposed to anything, and I'll explain how those occur, because we have another fracture, which is I. It starts out at the ethmoid. There's a little bit of missing bone, but then the fracture extends through the plate of the bottom of the eye socket. And again, that doesn't connect to the outside rim. So we have 1, 2, and then this eye, and then the one at the top. So at least 4 in this room. Those are called, a couple of those would be classic, what we call blowout fractures, because they don't connect to the eye, and basically that's a hydraulic force of something hitting the eye, not big enough to puncture the eye, but big enough to cause enough pressure to blow out the fractures of the orbit, which are relatively thin. So it's pretty classic blow to the eye area.
What I'd like to do, Dr. Garavaglia, since you used the clarification diagrams to describe them all, I'd like to publish the actual skull photographs.
So we're not seeing all of them, and this ruler's in the way, but let's get our a landmark. So we're looking at kind of the posterior right side. This would be your ear canal. This is that zygomatic arch. And this probably picture shows that fracture of the zygomatic arch the best. You can also see that opening, the diastatic fracture between these. This part of the zygomatic arch is the temporal bone, and this part's the zygoma. So you can see that opening of that, and it's kind of pushed in. Not the best picture to see the pushed in. Then we have this long fracture that goes just across that temporal bone here. Then we can see portion of this fracture that starts at the frontal, goes across the temporal again, goes across the frontal suture onto the temporal, and goes onto the squamous, and then you can see this fracture. Like that, and then this curvilinear fracture, and then we have this fracture here, and then this opening. You can kind of see the separation of that squamosa bone separating a bit. So this is a good picture of, you can see how that's separated. And the fracture's over here. Now this is that one that goes across the squamous bone. We also see, again, you can also see how it's recessed in that area. So it's kind of not on the bony projections by any mean. It's recessed in that kind of cavity, kind of that, how our temporal bones kind of go in on our face. It's kind of recessed.
Dr. Garavaglia, what is the significance of the fact that it's recessed?
Well, it's harder to get to. And so we're looking at this fracture here, and then that little fracture here. We can see the separation, again, of the squamosa from the parietal, and then we see part of this other fracture. Now we're going to be looking at some of the eye fractures. There's this fracture that goes down from the base of the eye socket on the lower edge. So this is where your eyeball should sit, and your optic nerve goes back into your brain back there. Your eyeball sits there. There's your nose, nasal cavity. There's that separation there at the zygomatic arch. So there's a fracture here. These are just where two bones come together. This is the fracture. And then there's a fracture on the frontal bone here. There's this bone missing here. That's the ethmoid plate. See, this is not a fracture. This is just the ethmoid plate's missing that bone, whether it was a comminuted fracture or whatever happened there. But there's clearly a fracture that goes across the base of this is a fracture.
Would that be classified as one of the blowout fractures?
Correct. That would be a classic blowout fracture at the base of the eye socket. And then there's a fracture across, I think we have better pictures of it across the top. This is a close-up of this fracture that goes down, fracture again across the maxillary bone, that plate there, fracture of the upper roof. That can also be seen at the base of the skull. When we saw the base of the skull and there was a fracture over the orbital plates, that's this one. That goes all the way through to the base of the skull. This is, not the best picture. There's a small fracture here, but I think we have better pictures. Again, this is a good picture of that top fracture. that kind of more complex fracture, which goes across. And then another fracture here, separation, this fracture, and I think we've seen this quite well on the zygomatic arch. Fracture there, separation there, diastatic fracture. There's that separation there. Okay. Now, this, we have actually, I'm glad he showed this because I forgot to mention this. This is also a fracture on the left eye. So we're no longer seeing the right eye, we're seeing a fracture of the left eye. This is the ethmoid plate, again, a fracture. This is completely onto the left side. Again, a classic blowout fracture where the eye's been pushed. You can get that like with a ball thrown at your eye, like where it would hit and push the eyeball back and it blows out, it fractures and that's a mechanism to keep your eye from bursting, right? You want something else to absorb the pressure, so it's the bones fracturing helps absorb that pressure. But you also, that's what you get with blows to the eye, blunt force trauma to the eye, that's big enough to kind of hit the eye, but not big enough or small enough to penetrate the eye. That's on the left. Oh, go back, please. This is not the best picture. It's just a chip fracture, a little kind of hinge fracture on the nose with this tiny little bit of 3/16 inch fracture right along the edge. Not the best picture. This is, again, this is that left eye again with that fracture. This is that tooth on the front. Remember the lower tooth? This yellow part, that's that dentin. You can see how sharp that is an old. We know she didn't have it when she went to the dentist about 10 days before she.
Before we proceed, Dr. Garavaglia, a quick question. You referenced dental records. Did you review the dental records of the child victim prior to writing your report and drawing your conclusions?
The dental records, as you notice in the report that we reviewed them, and they gave the dates of the dental records, because that's how we identified her.
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. You were talking about, again, the photograph on the screen, I don't have it number, but about the issue with the front tooth chip. Is there anything else you wanted to add on that?
Very sharp, that's the yellow part's the dentin, and that would have caused concern. Even if it had happened the day before, she'd complain about that. Because it would hurt. So this is that little fracture on the nose. This hinges, and then you can ever so slight continuation of the fracture along the edge. What we're doing is looking. Remember my diagram at the base of the skull. So this picture, Dr. Schultz must have taken it from the side, so we can see. So remember I said that, so this is the ethmoid, the cribriform plate, that would be the center of the midline, so that your nose sits right underneath that of the skull. So I'm trying to give you a base of what's midline. This is where your right eye socket is, and this is that fracture of the orbital plate that we talked about. So that's that fracture, and then the other fracture we had talked about was this long fracture. This is the other chip of the other chip on the tooth. Again, you can see a little bit of dent in there. 3. I mean, yeah, you can count them as approximately 5. You can count them as 4. You can count them as 6 because there's those diastatic fractures and so in that ballpark.
Okay. And how many additional fractures in the facial bones of the child victim?
So then we have the 4 fractures to the eye area on the right, some of which are in the eye socket, some of which are 2 on the edge of the eye socket, and then we have 1 on the left eye socket. So that's 4 and 5. So there's at least 10 to 11 total.
And then 2 chipped teeth.
And then 2 chipped teeth.
So you've sort of discussed it in the context of the individual fractures, but what kinds of forces would have to act on the child victim's skull in order to cause these fractures? And we'll start with the skull fractures to the right side of the head.
So what kind of forces. So we have to have enough force to fracture the bone.
Is that area of the skull, can you describe the thickness of that area of the skull?
Yeah, so that area of the skull is not as thick as, let's say, other areas of the skull, but it still takes a relatively amount of force. I mean, it wouldn't mean anything to how much newtons. I mean, this has been studied by automobiles and manufacturers. It's been studied in forensics. I think that temporal frontal squamous, I think it's somewhere in the vicinity of about 375 to 420 psi, like pounds pressure per square inch. It's in the realm of like something hitting with a great amount of force, a hand, a fist. Boxers are known to be able to create that much pressure. They can create about 5,000, or about kilonewtons, about 5 kilonewtons. It takes less than that to kill those, to fracture those on the side. So it's in the realm of somebody either hitting, or you can get a fracture like that sometimes with falling. Not very commonly. Most falls don't create that kind of force, particularly from a hand, just standing and falling. You don't usually see that, but it depends, like hit the curb. But these are, multiple fractures.
Do you have an opinion as to the minimum number of blows or contacts that would have been necessary to inflict the fractures that you observed?
Right. So originally, it said there's got to be minimum of 2, right? Because we've got this one right eye socket and we've got this right parietal, 2 separate areas. But at the time, I actually didn't see the one on the left, the blowout fracture of the left ethmoid. So I really think that's a different one. I don't think it's related to this eye because there's air in between. There's really no reason why that one would be created with this one. So it's minimum 2 or 3, and then it depends. These would be very difficult to get. I mean, one is much lower across that squamous bone than the ones that are upper. I think those 2 together, probably one blow or something happened. The zygomatic arch is a classic kind of blow to that area. And then the squamous bone, that could be associated with that. So I think in reality, it would be, you can say minimum of 2 or 3. More likely, it's going to be 4 or 5.
Okay. Would you have expected any of these skull fractures to bleed?
Skull fractures don't bleed, but the overlying scalp could bleed. The overlying tissue could bleed. You don't necessarily get it. Certainly people will just get like a really bad black eye, and there's, edema and some internal bleeding. But what you're talking about is a laceration where you've actually caused a break in the skin. Certainly some of them could have been. Enough pressure to cause the fracture could cause a laceration, but not necessarily, because sometimes it just depends kind of how wide it is it's hitting, what's hitting. And we know in medicine, we see these fractures and we don't necessarily have lacerations. So I can't say there's no skin, there's no soft tissue.
Now, do you have an opinion as to the type of instrument or mechanism that was used to inflict the blows? And if you could start with the right side of the skull and move across to the face.
Yeah, so the right side of the skull is a little more difficult because other things, any kind of instrument could have caused that, that was swung or hit with enough force, or her head against something with enough force to cause that. It isn't kind of a depressed skull fracture, so we're not expecting like a huge swing to the baseball bat kind of thing. It's certainly in an area that has been classic. The zygoma is a classic punch type of injury, that kind of zygomatic fracture, the zygoma. The blowout fractures and the fractures to the orbital plates on the eye and the rim, those are classic for a punch to the eye, especially causing those internal fractures, and also to that eye. So it could all be from just a fist, but I can't say for sure. I can just go with the pattern of what in medicine, what we see, classic blowout fractures, can be seen with other things hitting your eye. You can see that with a ball being thrown at your eye. You can see it with other things. It could be another object. I can't say because we don't have any skin markings to say. But I'm saying that the pattern of the fractures would not be inconsistent with just a fist.
You mentioned earlier the recessed nature of one of the fractures on the right side of the skull. When it comes to the blows or the mechanism that might have caused the right side skull fractures, what was the relevance of the recess?
Well, it's a little bit harder to get with just a flat kind of object like a 2x4 against the head. You could, or a flat floor. It would be a little harder to get those kind of fractures. But again, maybe you're with the corner of the 2x4, maybe you're the corner of the curb and not just the flat. So it's just a little bit different. It's not a typical pattern we see with just a fall.
Now, did you take any additional samples for testing during the course of your autopsy? Swabs, insects, tissue?
Yes.
At the time of your autopsy, the body of the decedent was in a condition where a positive identification couldn't be visually done. I think
Correct.
you mentioned that. What steps did you take to identify the decedent?
So part of the reason of bringing Dr. Schultz in was to do an anthropologic study to look to see if she was consistent with Miss Alexander, to see if the age was consistent by looking at the skull and the root development. Then we also brought in the odontologist, the dentist, to review her dental records also and to look at her teeth and to make a positive identification there. Dr. Schultz found that
without saying with Dr. Schultz.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
So that was, everything was consistent with my consultants that...
Judge, may we approach?
Dr. Garavaglia, did you also collect DNA samples, or what did you do to try to attempt to collect DNA samples from the decedent?
So I just thought that the best thing to do would be to use bone. And so I removed the right humerus and the right seventh rib and delivered it to FDLE so they could extract a DNA from the bone.
Now, I want to briefly talk about your internal examination. Was it difficult due to the level of decomposition?
Parts of it were, parts of it weren't. Clearly, the brain is pretty much liquefied. It was only 60 cc's of just liquid kind of goop. And then some of of course, I can't do a neck because there's no neck structures there as far as the soft tissue. I can't tell if she's strangled. I can't do any kind of examination that way. The vessels aren't there. Nothing's there. But the internal examination on the right lung would have been impossible. It's just amorphous material that's left. You couldn't even tell it was a lung. You can't tell it was even a heart. But surprisingly, the left lung, which was still in the cavity, you could see that it's got two lobes, and it did not appear to have any defects to it on the left.
Could I ask you specifically about her uterus?
Yeah, so the internal aspect is what I wanted to say. Below the diaphragm was, although decomposed, those organs were intact.
And were you able to do an examination of the decedent's uterus?
Yes, so the uterus is one of the last things, actually, to decompose ever. It's kind of a firm muscle. She doesn't have a vagina anymore. That's decomposed. It's pretty much decomposed up to the uterus. And you could even see the cervical os, the opening at the bottom of the uterus was still there.
Were you able to determine, based upon your examination of her uterus, whether or not she was pregnant?
She was definitely not pregnant.
And can you explain why you know that?
A couple of reasons. First of all, the uterus was 5 centimeters long. The inside, I look on the inside of the uterus, and it's got a very thin endometrium. The endometrium has to be very thick to support even an early pregnancy. So there's no evidence of pregnancy in the uterine cavity. I look in the ovaries. So at the beginning of a pregnancy, you have to maintain the hormones from the ovary, from the corpus luteum of pregnancy, and that becomes kind of a big yellow thing that you see in the ovary, and she didn't have that either.
Were you able to perform a sexual assault examination?
No, because she didn't have any tissues in the whole perineal region, as far as no skin, no labia, no vagina, no medial aspect, no middle aspect of the thighs, and all of that tissue is gone, even in the anal area. That's all decomposed, all missing. It's a lot of maggot and larval activity in that region.
Now, part of the overall role of the medical examiner is to render a conclusion on the cause and manner of death for a decedent. Is that correct?
Correct.
And under Florida law, the medical examiner is the only individual permitted to make that determination.
In Florida law, correct.
Can you explain to the jury the difference between the cause and manner of death?
So the cause of death is how that disease or injury started a process that resulted in that person dying. The manner of death is how that occurred, and we only have 5 manners of death, right? We have natural, accident, suicide, homicide, or just undetermined, that we can't tell. So in this case, she's got clear trauma that's in the realm of perimortem, with those skull fractures, with the defense kind of wound, incised wound of her hand. So there's clearly some type of homicidal violence that went on. And so, although I can't tell you exactly why she died, because none of those injuries would have necessarily caused her death, we're missing a lot of her, right? I can't tell you anything about the neck, whether she's any kind of trauma in the neck. So I can't really say for sure why she died. So the cause of death is just homicidal violence. I don't know exactly the mechanism. And the manner of death, the way she's found, with her shirt above her head, no pants on, no shoes, kind of dumped in the woods, you know, she's got trauma, and her body's been concealed to rot. It's a homicide. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that's a homicide, and that she died of homicidal violence, but I don't know the exact mechanism.
No further questions, Your Honor. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Garavaglia?
Good morning.
Dr. Garavaglia, you mentioned that there were numerous fractures in the victim's skull area and eye area and face in general. Is that correct?
Correct.
Isn't it a fact that a single blow to the head can cause multiple fractures?
Certainly it can, but it's not usually seen. Certainly you can get a couple of the blowout fractures. It would be rare to get both a fracture of the inferior orbit and the superior orbit. Superior orbit takes a lot more force to fracture. So could it be absolutely one to that right eye? I can't say for sure, but it could, but most likely 2 separate ones. Could have caused a couple of the blowout fractures. And then I don't see how it could have caused the blowout fracture to the left, because there's air in between. I mean, the hydraulic pressure is not going to be the same.
Well,
So that's at least 1, probably 2.
well, particularly on the orbital fractures being the eye, is that correct?
Correct.
Particularly orbital fractures or orbital injury, a blow can cause multiple fractures. Isn't that correct?
Right. We have to also see what we normally see, but you don't normally see 2 orbital rim fractures together. But I can't discount that it didn't occur, with enough force. So I said that it's possible it could be 1, but I'm saying that these 2, the 2 orbit rim fractures, are more likely 2 separate blows, because you're concentrating in 2 separate areas, that force.
Now, initially, when you wrote your autopsy report, you indicated that there were a minimum of 2 blows that must have been inflicted. Is that correct?
Right. It's clearly a minimum of 2, and that's the absolute, nobody can argue, minimum of 2, and then we have what's more likely. Now, honestly, in my report, I don't mention that left one, because I didn't find that until later. We didn't see it.
Did you look at the x-rays back on the autopsy?
Yes.
And the orbital fracture, the one that you did not find back then, weren't on the x-rays?
It's easier to see it on the skull. Those are very difficult to see with the quality of x-rays we have.
Well, I imagine there must have been a small fracture then if you couldn't see it.
Right. It's a typical blowout fracture on the inner aspect of the ethmoid on the left.
And by the way, is there any correlation between the size of the fracture and the amount of force required to inflict that fracture?
Not in a rough correlation, yes, but the fracture can kind of continue, but certainly more force can cause larger, more extensive fractures.
And And isn't bone density also a factor in determining just how much force is required to cause a fracture?
Bone density is one of the things that determines a fracture.
Did you look at the bone density and measure them with Ms. Chery?
No, but the density of the squamous bone in that area was not out of the realm of normal appearance.
What about the orbital fractures?
Orbital fractures, normal. Those bones are relatively thin. As I stated, the face, the eyes, they're actually made to take a punch. So you don't injure the brain, and that's exactly what they're kind of almost a baffling, right? So we don't want to injure the brain, so they're made to fracture a little more easily. They're thinner.
The bottom line is you really can't say definitively that it was definitely 4, definitely 5, definitely 6, or definitely 3. There's a range that you're giving us.
Right. I said, in my opinion, it was more likely at least 4. No question, 2 or 3.
The brain from Ms. Chery was liquefied, is that correct?
Correct.
And that means you couldn't find out or determine whether or not she had any brain contusions, is that correct?
That's correct.
What else did that prevent you from looking at specifically in her brain? Hemorrhaging?
Correct.
Okay. Do we even know whether Ms. Chery became unconscious as a result of the blows to the head?
We don't know that.
And in fact, isn't it a fact that when you get punched in the orbital region, which is the eyes, and the nose, you generally speaking do not suffer brain trauma as a result?
That is absolutely true. It can occur. It is certainly in the medical literature, but that's typically you do not lose brain consciousness with those fractures. Brain consciousness to the face are usually to the mandible area.
So if we don't know if the victim, or Ms. Chery in other words, suffered unconsciousness as a result of being punched, you can't discount the possibility that she could have just dusted herself off, even if she was bleeding a little bit, and just left the apartment on her own.
Well, you have to look at the whole pattern. So you're saying that she's got the fractures to the side of her head, an incised wound to the hand, and blowout fractures to the eye, and she's just walking off?
No. What I'm asking you is there's nothing to suggest that she couldn't have, for whatever reason, if she was able to or wanted to, simply leave her residence, assuming that she was attacked there, and simply had walked off. She had the physical capabilities of doing so, as opposed to her being unconscious.
Well, she did eventually die, so we know that there's something bad that happened.
By the way,
eventually caused her death.
By the way, how much time went by from the time of the blows being inflicted till the time she died?
To the time, we don't know, because we don't know all of her injuries. We think that those blows are just part of her injuries. There's something else that may have happened to her, because she's clearly, a 16-year-old girl is clearly dead now. So there's clearly some major thing that occurred, whether it's bleeding in the brain from the fractures or something that happened to her neck or her upper chest. We don't know.
I understand, but you can't discount the possibility that she may have been a victim of an assault, that thereby getting the head injuries, and then her dying later on from a different attack hours later.
Right, I guess. I suppose that's possible. I would suppose she'd call. From just the injuries,
well, what if,
right. I think you would really be hurting, though, from those
Dr.
injuries.
Dr. Rosalie, what if she was a runaway? Are you aware of the basic facts in this case?
I'm aware that how she's found. I'm aware that she was missing. I'm aware that she was seen that morning in good health. She has no health issues. And then I'm aware that there's no contact with her until she's found from her family.
My point being is you can't even definitively state that the skull fractures or the facial fractures or the injuries resulting in fractures in the face were inflicted inside her residence.
No, I don't know where they're inflicted. You'd have to look at I saw some blood pictures, but that was a while ago in her residence. You'd have to talk to the investigators where this all occurred.
And can we agree that we have no way of knowing whether or not a weapon was used versus hands to inflict the facial injuries?
I just wanted to be clear that I'm talking about the pattern we see, The pattern we see is fairly classic for a hand, a punch to the eye. That's in medicine. We see it. It's every day. People are assaulted and punched, and we see those kind of fractures. That's in the literature. That's well known. Can it be another object? Yeah, it could be. Could it be an automobile accident? I guess it could be, but we tend to see a little more different kind of pattern. But the top ones we see in usually assaults with women are fractures, blow-up fractures to the eye, that zygoma that's fractured, we see that. Those are very classic punches. Could it be something else? Right, because I don't have the skin and it's very difficult.
You would
for me to say.
agree, I assume, that none of those blows that the Ms. Chery suffered to the face were life-threatening?
Right, I would, if it was clearly would have caused her death, I would have said it's from the blows. But I can't say for sure that they caused her death. They would have been life-altering.
And you would agree, I assume, that no other injuries that she had, whether it was the four superficial force injuries, the four sharp force injuries, or anything else for that matter, were life-threatening. Would you agree with that?
Correct.
And the bottom line, I think you alluded to it in your direct testimony, your autopsy was made more difficult by the fact that Ms. Chery suffered decomposition. Is that correct?
Correct.
Decomposition simply means that the tissue is rotting off the body. Is that correct?
That is correct. She is rotting in the field where she, again, the pattern appears to be a dump or a placement of the body there.
So you don't have any skin to work with to look at it forensically. Is that correct?
I have a lot of skin on the front and the abdomen, the lower chest. I don't have anything on the top and from basically the clavicles up.
So you can, for instance, opine that the victim died because she was stabbed. You can't say that.
No, I'm just saying she has a stab type wound and a defensive type wound of an incised nature of her hand. I can't say that that's why she died.
And you can't say, for instance, that the victim died because of strangulation.
No, because those tissues are not there.
And the bottom line is we don't, I think as you were saying, we just don't know what actually caused her death.
That's correct. We do know that she suffered trauma prior to her death.
But the trauma was not life-threatening, though.
Oh, it could be life-threatening. We just can't say because the brain is no longer there.
Well, when you said could be life-threatening, that would be entirely speculative on your part.
Well, we do know that fractures to that area can cause death. You don't even need fractures to cause death, but we have clear evidence that she suffered trauma to the skull, which could have affected the brain.
What?
Not the ones on the face necessarily, but the ones on the side. Could they have caused her death? Yes, they could have caused their death. Did it? I can't say for sure.
I mean, the bottom line, you can't even give a percentage probability as to the likelihood of the fractures causing death, because that would be something that you just simply cannot know.
Correct.
Now, the fracture lines, were they arrested or not arrested?
They were not arrested. They didn't touch each other.
Okay.
The one fracture didn't stop another fracture.
So I assume that if the fractures were not arrested, you can't determine the order of the blows.
Correct.
So we have no way of knowing, obviously, if she was incapacitated or not from any of those blows to the head. Is that correct?
Correct. Typically, I can go with typical pattern seen in medicine. You don't necessarily need to be incapacitated with the blows to the eye. You wouldn't be incapacitated with any kind of blow to the teeth that caused the chip. Certainly the facial ones, you most likely wouldn't be incapacitated.
And I think you made a reference to the lacerations. You simply can't tell or determine how much, if anything, she would have bled at the scene from the head injuries.
Correct.
And would it be safe to say that the real problem in this case is that you can't look at underlying trauma because of the decomposition. Is that correct?
So I can't look at the underlying trauma to the head, and I can't look at trauma to the neck. I can look fairly clear that the trauma I didn't see trauma in the left lung. I can't say anything about the right or the heart. And the abdomen certainly didn't have any trauma.
So when the left lung didn't have any trauma, that would tell you that she wasn't stabbed deeply, for instance. Is that correct?
No, just went several inches, inch or inch and a half into the breast.
When you said that that injury that she had, the non-life-threatening injury that went into her breast, that went in about an inch deep, is that correct?
Correct.
Now, the skin stretches, is that correct, upon contact?
Right. So that's a rough, but as far as the skin, that's why it's very difficult for the, to go with really the size of that wound on the skin. I mean, it's contracted, and then the breast tissue is, somewhat malleable. So I try to, as soon as I lift, to see how far it goes down. But it clearly goes down into that tissue. That's why I took that picture. You can lift it up, you can see it goes into it. So whether it's an inch and a half, I can't say.
When you, for lack of a better term, stab somebody, when you stab somebody in the muscle, you're going to require a lot more force than is required to stab somebody through their fat tissue. If you try to determine how much force you need to have the object enter 1 inch in the body, is that correct?
Right. So the harder part on that would probably be going through the skin.
Okay, well, in her case, the incised wound by the left nipple occurred on the breast where there's lots of fatty tissue. Is that correct?
Right. The breast is kind of fibrous, fatty tissue that it went through.
So it would take a lot less force to cause that superficial injury versus, let's say, getting stabbed in a muscular region of the body. Is that accurate?
Yeah, to a degree, because it's not going, I think the hardest part for that would be going through, just breaking the skin with a knife would probably be the more difficult part to go through.
And by the way, you can't determine that a knife was used to inflict that superficial injury on her left breast nipple. Is that correct?
No, just a sharp force instrument.
Could it have been a screwdriver?
No, wasn't a screwdriver.
What about scissors?
Now, the pattern on it could be maybe with one blade of the scissors. Scissors patterns tend to be a little bit different pattern, and the scissors certainly, again, you'd have to do it with the one blade of the scissors on the hand.
What about a sharp piece of glass, assuming that broken piece of glass was not irregular in shape?
Yeah, so most glass, what we find, tend to be irregular pieces and wouldn't cause that. The kind of glass that would be able to do something like that would be maybe a broken pane, where you'd get a shard that was pretty long and sharp. That could do it.
The injury to her left breast, I assume, could have been caused either at the time of death or even after after her death. Is that correct?
That's correct. But before decomposition.
The same thing with the irregular injury in the back. Could that have been caused after death?
Certainly not in the position she was, because she's on her back. Certainly not in the position her shirt was, because it didn't line up with her shirt there. But could somebody have flipped her over once she was dead and stabbed her in the back? Yeah.
And you mentioned the shirt. You're making the assumption that she was wearing the shirt at the time she received the attack with the protrusion next to her left nipple. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm making the assumption that the shirt might have been on her, but certainly the one on the back, it appears that the shirt was on her. I can't say whether the shirt was on her when she got the nipple wound, right, because there's no defect to the shirt.
I mean, there was no, you can't discount the possibility that small defect, you would call it a cut, I assume, right?
That's stab defect.
That small hole, whatever you want to call it, wasn't there from a week earlier, and she just didn't bother tossing the shirt out. You can't rule that out, I assume.
It matches to the defect in her skin, so that's usually a pattern we see when, so it's ironic that she would have a defect, a linear defect that goes into the musculature of her back, and it matches where the defect is from the shirt, but the shirt one got the defect a week earlier, and then she didn't have the shirt on and got it at the same spot. I guess that is not beyond the realm of possibility, but it would not be a pattern that I would normally see. And you certainly would mention to somebody you have a defect to your back, I would think, to her
By the way,
family. She's only 16.
That shirt that you have here framed, that's offered into evidence, that has no rips on it, is that correct?
That's correct. There's no defects to the shirt, no rips, no bite mark, no tears to it,
No signs
animal.
no signs of a struggle,
Except for the defect.
right? Which we don't know when it was put there, I assume, the defect.
Well, it matches the one defect on the back, so it appears that they were about the same time.
Did you test the shirt to see whether or not blood or traces of blood were on that shirt?
No, it was soaked with decompositional fluid, which was we're all kind of blackish, wet. And fat, like decomposed fatty greasiness.
So you mentioned the chipped teeth, is that correct?
I did mention chipped teeth.
So your office, or your former office, the ME's office, they hired a forensic odontologist, is that correct?
Yeah, we have him as one of our consultants that does all of our identifications.
Does Dr. Korn ring a bell?
Yeah, Dr. Korn is our consultant.
So he worked on this case, is that correct?
Correct.
Would you claim to have the same level of expertise when it comes to forensic odontology, or would you defer to him?
As far as making that identification,
No. As far as not making an ID, as far as opining as to dental injuries.
I don't know Dr. Korn's expertise on dental injuries. I don't hire him for that. I hire him for dental identifications.
Well, you're aware that he testified in court yesterday.
No, I
You're
didn't.
not aware of that?
Yeah, no.
If you were to hear him testify that not a lot of force would have been.
Objection, commenting on another witness's testimony.
Sustained.
Dr. Garibaldi, do you opine that not a lot of force would have been, do you opine that not a lot of force would necessarily have to have been used to inflict the chipped teeth?
I would imagine, because people chip teeth on hard candy. I don't know what kind of force that is, but it just shows that she has a chipped teeth that she didn't have before.
Which you can get
all I meant.
from falling down, for instance, right?
I imagine you could chip your teeth very easily from falling down.
Having somebody throw an object at your mouth and you not catching it with your hands and hitting your mouth, that can cause chipped teeth also.
That can. Although the one on the lateral aspect's a little odd, because that is protected somewhat from in your mouth.
So I think you testified earlier that the four sharp force injuries, the ones on her back and her left breast, could have been caused post-mortem, in other words, after her death. Is that correct?
Right. I can't say. So when we say post-mortem, it's a little different, like what an so with us, it means that there's no blood pumping, right? So there's, because you don't see any vital signs. Well, I'm not going to see that with that state of decomposition. It doesn't look like it occurred. They didn't occur from decomposition. It didn't occur like as she's decomposing. You can see because of the sharp nature of them and the pattern of them and the way it went through the breast tissue. So I would say she was still in a relatively fresh state when those occurred.
So, but you believe the hand superficial injuries were not caused after her death, is that correct?
Right, because of the pattern of the way that's folded to cause that little flap.
You called them quote-unquote defensive wounds, is that correct?
That's typically, again, you could have cut that yourself with an avocado, I guess.
I mean, it's certainly
Slicing it out, trying to get the pit out of an avocado, that you can see it that way. But you wouldn't cut yourself in the breast with an avocado, so getting the pit
I
out.
understand
So my
that.
point is, it's a pattern we see that when there's other stab-type defects on the body, and then you see it on the hand, then you can call it a defensive wound.
But now we're talking about the hand wound in isolation. But the bottom line is, it certainly is plausible to cut yourself innocently. Isn't that correct? You mentioned cutting yourself with an avocado cutting.
Right, but, so the thenar eminence, yes, that little kind of patch there, that little kind of flap, is usually, the thumb is going to be opposed. So if she's holding the avocado, yes, that would hurt a lot, and you go to the ER and get stitches. That wound would need stitches. That thing is going to bleed badly, and it is not a trivial wound. So if she had that right before she died, she'd do something about it. But the problem is we have to look at the totality of the pattern. So she's got this with skull fractures, with stab wounds. So
You can also get what you refer to as defensive wounds if you yourself are the one holding the knife and somebody's struggling, or a sharp object, and somebody's struggling with you over it.
right,
Isn't that correct?
she could be, right, you can get that kind of wound. But again, she's got the one, we know she's got a stab wound to her, so she's trying to get that knife away.
I understand.
Whether she's the perpetrator or not, I can't
I mean, the
tell you.
bottom line, again, you're elaborating beyond my question. The bottom line is that if I have a sharp-like object in my hand, like a knife or whatever you want to call it, and I'm coming towards you, and you grab my hand, and we're struggling it, even though I'm the one holding that knife, I can get the exact same cut as Ms. Chery had. Is
You
that
can.
correct? Now, I think you had said that there were some DNA swabs taken from the victim's nipple. Is that correct?
Right,
Oh, okay. Did you also take DNA swabs off of her toes and feet?
I did.
And the purpose of that, I assume, was to try to determine whether or not it's possible to get the suspect's DNA, if the suspect had contact with those parts of the body. Is that
I had very low hopes for that, but sometimes people ask you, even if you think you're not, I mean, because her skin is gone, the humidity and the heat, I would have thought would have destroyed that DNA, but I wouldn't want you to come up and say, why didn't you do that? And I'd have to describe to you, well, the heat and humidity would have destroyed that DNA, but so I did it anyway. And so, but I did have hope that the cervical os might have had some.
I'd never ask you that question, by the way.
What?
I'd never ask you that question, by the way. But I would ask you, did you take DNA from under the victim's fingernails?
She didn't have fingernails.
So at that point, they were already gone?
Yeah, they were gone.
Because of decomposition?
Correct.
And would I be safe in assuming that the mandible, the jaw, which was found several feet away from her, was due to decomposition? Or was it defects of decomposition, or was it animal activity?
Oh, the fact that it's gone, or it's moved over, is animal activity.
What about the hair weave? Were you aware that the victim wore apparently a hair weave?
Yes, I described that in my report, if you'd read that, and it said that it's several feet from the body, and there's two little braids in there, and then there's hair woven into her natural hair. It's not uncommon for what we call a hair mat to come off like together as it sloughs off. That also was a couple feet right by the mandible.
Okay. Are you aware whether or not there were any vultures in the area?
I predict that there probably was. The black vulture is common around here, and that certainly could have been some of the scavenging we saw on the arms without any gnaw marks. The black vultures tend to go for open areas, though, where there's injuries.
Did you consult with anybody at anywhere, whether it's UF or FSU, on bite marks from vultures?
I am familiar with a lot of decompositional changes. I would say I don't think there are very few people that have done as many decomposition bodies as I did, since I've worked for 10 years in Texas and, I don't know, 15 years in Florida. I have done tremendous numbers of decompositional artifact, and changes are common. We typically don't see a lot of vulture marks on the body because they tend to go for more open areas. So they're going to make it worse. But not like go through intact skin. And that would be my experience in Texas and here.
Did you consult with was it the Body Farm in Gainesville?
I would say that I didn't have any marks on the body that were suggestive of Vulture isn't going to cause one slit in the breast that goes down cleanly into the breast tissue. The one on the back wasn't exposed to vultures, and vultures will not go through a T-shirt like that. They will not.
There was definitely scavenging on the victim's body.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
The victim also had a lot of maggots, and particularly inside her vagina.
Yes.
Vagina was gone, but in her pelvis area.
Pelvic area. The peritoneal reflection, the inside was still intact, but all the muscles, the floor of the pelvis was completely gone, as well as the musculature, the labia, all of that is gone. It's just a kind of a soft tissue with maggots in that area.
Is it possible to take, as far as you know, I'm sure it's beyond your expertise, but is it possible, if you know, to take insect larvae on a dead body, if it exists, and then have an entomologist, an expert in insects and ants, look at it to try to determine from the larvae how long that person's been dead?
Yes, and if you notice in the report, I did do that and submitted it. So we removed larvae both for DNA and for possible timing. I didn't think time of death was particularly significant in this case, since it was relatively small. She was missing on the 28th. She's found on the 1st. It's 4 days. Time of death for 4 days in Florida, she was quite decomposed. It was very hot in August.
Well, plus it was very humid, wasn't it?
And very humid.
And so the combination of heat and humidity would cause your body to decompose quickly. Is that correct?
Correct.
Much more quickly than in Anchorage, Alaska in the wintertime, right?
They're pristine in Anchorage, Alaska in the wintertime.
So the bottom line is we can't say for certain that the victim died on July 28, 2014. There's just no way of knowing.
Well, so she's decomposed in the fact that her brain is liquefied. That's very unusual even for 3 or 4 days. Even for 4 days, that's unusual. So if I had to just look at this body and knew nothing about how long she was out there, I would have actually given it closer to 5 or 6 days. But the humidity and heat always surprised me. I would not say it's shorter time I would have said longer time. So to say that she's that decomposed in 3 days is even harder to believe. So I would say it's consistent with her dying that day, because of that advanced decomposition she's got on the body.
Well, the fact that her brain was liquefied is hard to believe also. Isn't that correct?
That's what I'm saying. It would be less liquefied in 3 days.
Doesn't the rate of decomposition of a body, isn't that dependent on a lot of different factors?
Heat and humidity are two big ones.
Yeah. What are the other ones that influence the rate of decomposition?
Well, whether she's in the sun and if there's injury to that area. So if there's injury to an area, you're going to decompose faster. And if there's bugs present. So she's got a lot of bugs present. We know there's some injuries to the head. That could be partly why she's so decomposed. I thought it was interesting how bad the neck was, which is why I would opine maybe there's something going on in the neck also, because that's so decomposed, because the bottom half isn't. The way the sun is shining on you is also a component.
Excuse me, are you suggesting that because the neck was so heavily decomposed, that there may have been trauma to her neck, although you don't know?
We don't know anything about the front of her neck. There is some severe decomposition to the neck. It could be natural, or it could be, you asked me things that cause increase in decomposition, and I mentioned that trauma is one of the things. Trauma to an area will increase that decomposition.
And doesn't exposure to sunlight also increase the rate of decomposition?
Correct.
And certainly because of her, well, I think you already mentioned that there's no pregnancy indicated in the victim. Is that correct?
There's absolutely no pregnancy.
The victim apparently had some numerous teeth that were displaced. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, that's not unusual when somebody dies. It happens quite often post-mortem.
Yes, I would assume those are just postmortem loss of teeth.
So you don't put any stock in that, I take it?
That's correct.
And again, just to reiterate, we saw some pictures in evidence, but a lot of her organs were essentially an amorphous glob of tissue.
Just 3.
Well, that made it difficult to see whether trauma even exists.
I can't say whether trauma existed on the brain, the right lung, or the heart. The aorta was completely intact, the left lung was intact, the pelvic, inside the pelvic cavity was intact. There were no trauma there.
The victim, Ms. Chery, had a blood alcohol level of 0.6, I'm sorry, that would make her, that's toxically high, 0.067, is that correct?
Correct.
Now, I understand that sometimes post-mortem, in other words, post-death, alcohol levels can rise with individuals, is that correct?
That is a level that we would typically see with that type of decomposition.
But the level that you would see ranges from 0 to 0.10, isn't that correct?
Some authors even say it can even go up above 1. So, right, it can be nothing or it could be up to over 1.
So we can't even say that she had, a couple of drinks, presumably more than a couple of given her body weight. We can't even say that. We wouldn't even know whether she did or didn't.
Right, but I will reiterate that in Florida, since I do a lot of decomposition, most of them will have a blood alcohol level with the decomp bodies.
Was the liver able to be looked at, or was that also an amorphous piece of organ?
No, I described the liver in the autopsy report. It's got decompositional holes, it's got a smooth capsule, and I could cut it, and I saw no evidence of disease or trauma there.
So just to summarize, if I can recap your testimony, we don't know whether Ms. Chery did or didn't become unconscious as a result of the head blows. Is that correct?
That's correct.
We can agree, I assume, that the head blows were not life-threatening.
The head blows to the face were not life-threatening. The ones to the side could or could not have been life-threatening. I would have to look at the brain. It's not the skull fractures that cause injury. It's the problem to the brain that causes the death. So I don't know how it reacted to
But
the
of course-
brain. But is there enough force with those fractures? And have I seen death associated with fractures like that? Yes.
But of course, the brain was liquefied, so you can't even determine whether any potential blow to the temporal region would have caused her a brain trauma.
Right. I can't say for sure whether that was the definitive injury that caused her death.
And we can't opine as to whether or not she lived 8, 10, 12, 14 hours, make up a number, after the head injuries, because you just can't piece together what happened afterwards. Is that correct? We can't-
Well, you would notice if somebody had seen her 8, 12, 10 hours earlier, that she'd be clearly not in a good shape with that kind of skull fractures and blows to the face. So if her family or mother saw her in the morning, you would know if she had those injuries. You would know.
But by the way, can't some skull fractures be asymptomatic? In other words, you don't exhibit symptoms?
She's got 11 of them.
Okay. Not all of them, though, none of them are fatal in and of themselves. Isn't that correct?
But they would have caused swelling. Now, you would cause a black eye. You would be in pain.
And-
A skull fracture is not trivial.
And obviously, you can't pinpoint the time when those skull fractures were inflicted. Is that correct?
Right. I considered the pattern of injuries all peri-mortem, that some type of struggle occurred with blows to the face and to the side of the head, and in that struggle there was sharp force used. That was my conclusion.
So we just basically know that she may well have been a victim of an assault, but we know that the assault didn't necessarily kill her. Is that ultimately the conclusion?
She is dead, and there is no history of any disease, and she's found in the woods with no clothes on, no shoes. She's clearly not walking around those woods barefoot with no bra and rolled down panties. I mean, right. I don't know, and it looks like that's a dump, that a body was placed there. So she's assaulted, and her body is hidden. That we know for sure.
But I'll state the obvious. We don't know what happened from the time of the assault till the time her body was dumped in the woods.
Correct.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Redirect.
Dr. Garavaglia, would you expect, based upon your training and experience, to see the type of defensive wound that you've described as a defensive wound to the child victim's hand if she was unconscious?
No.
I believe you said that the blood alcohol level detected in Ms. Chery at the during the testing of the materials from the autopsy was consistent with the amount of decomposition she had.
Correct.
At one point, you said that the injuries to Ms. Chery that you were able to observe would have been life-altering. Can you describe what you meant by that statement?
She would be in pain. She would, if she's still alive, she would be in a lot of pain with the blows to the face. She would have swelling of the face. She may or may not be bleeding, but she certainly would have swelling of the tissues overlying all of those fractures, and it would be painful.
At one point, Mr. Schmier asked you to, quote, talk about the hand injury in isolation. You remember him saying that?
Right.
Do you make or draw any of your conclusions in isolation?
Never.
Why not?
Because you have to look at the whole pattern of what you find.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. May this witness be released from subpoena and from the courthouse?
Yes, she may.
Thank you. Ma'am, thank you so much. You are free to go.